Chapter 9. I first met Jesus not long after I arrived in Rata. He was out on the veranda smoking a fashionable brand of cigarettes. He was beautifully handsome, with intense blue eyes that pierced you and dared you to go beyond the superficial, to immediately bypass chit-chat. He was also distinctive in that his legs shook wildly, up and down, rapidly and continuously, making you wonder if there were little earthquakes happening when you sat close to him. Jesus, whose real name was Andrew, stood out as he was permanently dressed in hospital-issue striped pyjamas and dressing gown, on account of his having made several attempts to run away from the ward following his involuntary incarceration there. Having his clothes taken from him was a source of huge indignity to Andrew, as was his committal and the compulsory treatment order he was under, which gave the hospital legal permission to forcibly medicate him against his will. We became firm friends and would often sit together at mealtimes and swap our pills just for fun. His were really strong though, no wonder he hated them so much, and no wonder his legs shook, although the nursing staff insisted that he was exaggerating the effects as part of his campaign of non-compliance against his treatment plan. But those little blue pills were just about enough to put a horse in a coma, and I sure needed to have a good lie down after I'd taken them. Jesus Andrew had a mind like a steel trap. In his late 20s he'd been studying physics at university when he became depressed after the recent suicide of his father. He had also smoked a bit of weed during his varsity time and was convinced that this hadn't done his mental state much good either. His diagnosis was that of schizophrenia, largely pasted to him, it seemed, because of his strong faith and entrenched, often curious religious beliefs. The Jesus tag was something the hospital had applied and used against him. The doctors had taken this from their interpretation of his attempts to explain his beliefs to them. But what he did firmly believe was that Jesus embodied all the good in people. He believed that in Christ's teachings could be found the solution to most of the world's and the individual's problems, and he wanted to live like him. Jesus Andrew was a gentle, strong and loving person, but hospitalisation did not appear to be doing him much good. A psychiatric institution is a very difficult place to be for sensitive people, for anyone really. Living in a closed environment with the combined weight of 30 or more people suffering in personal tragedy is a deep and sometimes miserable experience. And some of the treatments and methods of behaviour control carried out by staff occupy a very grey area between being legitimate attempts to improve a patient's well-being and becoming illegitimate abuses of power. I remember vividly the first time I experienced just how strongly Andrew felt about the injustices he saw occurring in the psychiatric system. It was over one of these very grey areas indeed. Andrew and I were outside smoking together on the front steps one morning, when through the door burst an extremely distressed young woman who was in hospital receiving treatment for her life-threatening anorexia nervosa. She was running, howling and crying and being hotly pursued by at least 3 nurses, who eventually swarmed over her and literally picked her up kicking and screaming and dragged her off back inside. It was time for her next round of ECT, electroconvulsive therapy, commonly known as shock treatment, and she did not want to go. Andrew and I were horrified. It was an ugly display of power and abuse right before our eyes. Andrew had tears rolling down his face as he muttered, "Those bastards, those fucking bastards." He never forgave the ironically titled mental health system for imposing what he perceived as state-sanctioned torture upon innocent, vulnerable and suffering individuals. Andrew personified one of the great paradoxes of psychiatric intervention. That is, that it's really hard to get into the system when you initially need help, but once you're in, it can be even harder to get out, and many people just don't make it. Andrew died in July 2007, some 14 years after that admission, while still in the clutches of the system. They just wouldn't let him go. but at the same time they never really had anything to offer him, or nothing that he wanted anyway. I credit Andrew with helping me to turn my illness around on that first admission. I was still very suicidal in those first few weeks of hospital. I was on special obs, which is constant supervision, and I'd made another plan. One day I escaped the eyes of the nurses and walked down to the main road. I sat at a bus stop, mesmerising myself by watching traffic roll past and wondering whether I could really push myself to jump out in front of a truck. It doesn't pay to play with these obsessions, as sooner or later comes the compulsion to act. But next thing, Andrew appeared beside me and wanted to know what I was doing there. So I told him. He really had me on about it. "Think about the truck driver," he said. "That poor guy would never ever get over it if he ran you over, especially if he killed you. It would ruin his life. And what about his wife and kids? Think about that. You can't do that to someone. Just because you're hurting doesn't mean you can inflict that on someone else. Come back to the ward with me. You'll be okay." So I went. I followed Andrew like a lamb back to the ward. And somewhere in that interaction, I made a decision to live. I resolved to banish from myself as best I could the suicidal thoughts and impulses that had taken possession of my will to live. I had made a true friend, and that was reason to stick around. Then there was Pelly. She was a fellow traveller with Andrew and I in that first visit to Rata, and also became a good friend. She was the same age as me and was in hospital, ostensibly being treated for a prolonged episode of postnatal depression, which had set in after the birth of her daughter, who was now 3 years old. Pelly was, like Andrew and myself, another young person from a middle-class background, totally struggling to find her way in the world. Also, like myself, she had a king-size cannabis habit. She was trying to outrun and escape from the nightmare of fear and inadequacy she felt over her transition to motherhood. Her daughter had for now been removed from her care and was occasionally brought to the hospital by Pelly's parents for supervised access visits. These visits were torturous for everyone involved. Their short time together and having to let her daughter go at the end of the visits was emotionally devastating for Pelly, and was distressing for all of us witnessing the traumatic separations. A lot of scenes went down on those front steps of Rata Villa. That's the thing about all being in hospital together. We experience firsthand each other's trials and adversities. You couldn't escape it unless you happened to be away from the ward at the time. Mental hospital was a very raw experience. We were totally stripped bare before one another. Pelly had a different take from Andrew on hospital life. Unlike him, she saw it as being akin to staying in a hotel. She couldn't believe that they just brought you all this food, you didn't have to clean up after yourself, you didn't have to do any housework, and they gave you free drugs. Everything was laid on. She once confided in me that the whole time she was there, she was wondering how much it would all cost when they sent her the bill. She really did get worried about this, though, the day she went completely ape after one of the access visits. She picked up the big steel ashtray off the veranda, one of those outdoor ones with the foot pedal, and proceeded to smash it through several large windows of the ward frontage. Those of us witnessing this thought it was a great joke, but later Pelly said she had really freaked out wondering how much they would add on to her bill for all the damage. There was no bill to pay at Rata, though, not a monetary one anyway. But the price to all of us there in the currency of our collapsed self-esteems, our abandoned hopes, our faltered trajectories of adult growth, our own personal miseries, was a penalty exacted from us at all costs. Some of the patients I was in hospital with, who all felt like friends really, were never able to clear their metaphorical debt. Wynne and Milton, two of the men lost in their severe depressions, took their own lives after leaving hospital. In fact, Milton used to joke with us in that black humour that only other patients can find amusing, that what he had failed to account for in the botched suicide attempt that had brought him into hospital was that he should have taken the 72 Prozac capsules after he had reached his destination by car, not before he tried to drive there. He recalled suddenly being completely unable to operate the car as the overdose started to kick in, and ended up at a petrol station where staff hastily called the ambulance. He got it right the next time though, and another sensitive soul's life was lost. Depression is a fatal disease. The great leveller at Rata was that none of us were just plain crazy. Well, not in any stereotypical sense of the word anyway. We were all ordinary people, victims of some sort of life breakdown. For some, the breakdown was brought about by their own actions. For others, the result of things done to them. And for many like myself, it had become a complicated cocktail of the two. One of the doctors at Rata confessed to me that she believed 98% of women in psychiatric care have been raped or sexually abused as children, and then she revised that, saying it was probably more like 99.5%. To me, her opinion is significant. It touches on the truth about the prevalence of sexual abuse in New Zealand society, and speaks damningly of the devastation and often irreversible damage it does to those who survive it. The cost of this plague to individuals, families and society is higher than most people could ever imagine. This cost is reflected not only in our rates of psychiatric admissions and suicides, but across the board in our justice, welfare and accident compensation systems, and in the figuring of every negative social indices you care to name. Sexual abuse creates extremely messy, complicated and dysfunctional human beings, and we are everywhere.